cast shadows, and its only company is the buzz of a dim light at the edge of a dark field of tall grass. A woman walks alone, unaware. From the shadows, a stranger emerges to commit horrible assaults, leaving a trail of victims. Though difficult, the biggest help in this case was time. I'm Eric Chapman, your host for Dispatches, the York Regional Police podcast. I'm joined with Inspector Simon James and Staff Sergeant Mustafa Durgan from Peel. And this episode is all about Project Blue Light. Inspector James, tell us about your relationship with YRP.
I've worked for YRP for just over 20 years. I'm currently the inspector in charge of our Professional Standards Bureau. Spent the vast majority of my career working in our Major Crimes Bureau, in the Special Victims Unit, homicide, sex assault, child abuse, human trafficking, units like that, as well as I worked in our 2-district Criminal Investigations Bureau in the past as well.
Wow, that's an incredible career. What is it about policing that got you into it and got you this interested to have such a successful career?
I don't know. I've always wanted to do it since I was a young kid, and the investigative world kind of always interested me, and that's where I've worked most of my time. But policing in general, it's a lot of different avenues you can take, a lot of different units you can work in. That's what makes it kind of unique and a really interesting job.
Awesome. Or traffic, like Staff Sergeant Mustafa Durgan. Tell us about, you're the new kid on the block or from the other city. You're from Peel. Tell us about your career.
Yeah, so Peel basically covers the city of Mississauga and Brampton. I've been a police officer for almost 22 years now. I started off working just uniform patrol at 22 Division, which is the west end of Brampton. From there, kind of progressed, went in our Criminal Investigations Bureau, our Special Victims Unit, where they investigate child abuse and sex assaults. Worked in our Homicide and Missing Persons Bureau. I've got promoted a few times, and I've also worked in our Intelligence Bureau, and then now I'm in our Traffic Services, where I'm kind of overseeing our strategic enforcement side and our impaired driving enforcement, and we have what's called a Safer Roads team.
Okay, why policing for you? That's a long, and again, I have two very successful officers here. Why policing for you?
Well, I think early on I had like a desire to help people. Before joining policing, I was in the military. And then I made the leap to policing, and it was something that I enjoyed. I always say commitment to work, and it will always kind of pay in the long run if you continue to work hard and do your job, basically. And it's kind of worked out for me in that sense. Where it's got me where I am today, successful in my career and also in my home life too, with my family and all that stuff.
Right. The first incident happened in Peel region. And so can you take us back to the night of those events?
Sure. So it's going back to September 27th. It was actually late in the evening from the 26th to the 27th in 2013. The victim in our incident was a resident of Mississauga, was commuting, taking public transit in the Mississauga area late at night on the evening of the 26th of September, which was a Thursday going into the Friday. She got off public transit in the area of Hurontario Street and just south of South Service Road, which is just around the QEW. And then she was walking, after getting off the transit, she was walking along South Service Road. And while walking on that street, she was blitz attacked by the assailant or the offender, who later was identified as Mr. David Cho.
What do you mean by blitz attacked?
So in this incident where he basically was lying in a prone position underneath a tree, and as the victim was approaching towards her, she had not seen him until he made his run towards her. There was some description regarding some grunting noises made by the offender while he was running towards her, which kind of caught our victim off guard, and then grabbed her forcefully, and then dragged her deep into the bushes area in a wooded kind of bushy area where he sexually assaulted her. After the attack, so during the attack, he brandished a weapon, assaulted the victim both physically and sexually. And then after the attack and the sexual assault, he threatened our victim. where if he heard about this in the news or she reported to police, that he would come back, kill her and her family. Took some personal identification from the victim, indicating that he knows who she is, and then basically directed her to turn around, and after a certain period of time, she can leave. So at that time, during that time where he turned around, that's when he made his getaway. Shortly thereafter, the victim complied with the offender, and then shortly thereafter contacted police. And then where we came, so first we had uniform response, and then the appropriate investigative units were notified, which at that time I was in our special victims unit. And I was assigned as the officer in charge of the investigation. So we commenced an investigation. During the attack, the offender left forensic evidence at the scene of the crime. From there, we investigated. We did a thorough and extensive investigation on our part, and then which yielded to basically not identifying who the offender was at that time.
And then we turned to York, where Inspector, you had a case that we find was connected, but tell us about that case.
Yeah, so just after almost a year later, just over a year later, on November 13th, 2014, a young girl exited a transit bus similar to the Peel case at Yonge Street and Bernard Avenue in Richmond Hill. And she proceeded to walk westbound on Canyon Hill Avenue. And at that time, the south side of the road was a field with tall grass that was about 6 feet in height. Since they've built condos and things there since then, but in 2014, it was just a field. And as she was walking west on Canyon Hill, she was approached by the offender, who was already masked. He brandished a large knife, took physical control of the victim, and dragged her over a fence and into that field, about 50 meters into the field. So the area of the scene was fairly hidden, and it's not an area that people would really be able to see you in. Once in the field, he bound the victim and tied her up and violently sexually assaulted her and physically assaulted her. And similar to the Peel attack, certain words were used that were similar, and threats were made that were similar to the Peel incident. This attack lasted for quite some time in the field, ultimately ending with the offender threatening the victim and leaving the area. So after that, the York Regional Police Special Victims Unit engaged in a thorough investigation. Our forensics teams processed the scene, and various officers from different units were working on this case. Forensic evidence was left at the scene by the offender. That evidence was loaded onto the National DNA Databank, and the DNA linked from the York case to the Peel case. Now, it doesn't identify who the offender was, but it means it's the same individual responsible. So at that time, we knew we had a serial offender who was operating in 2 different jurisdictions. And in Ontario, there is a protocol for that police services engage in when it becomes a multi-jurisdictional case. And that's kind of how this task force started. We had meetings, and it formed after that.
Have there been many multi-jurisdictional cases in York history?
They come and go. There's a certain threshold that we have to meet in order to make it a multi-jurisdictional case. Sex assaults and homicides being the 2 primary offenses that require it's called our major case management format. Mm-hmm. And you have to have a multi-jurisdictional major case manager to run those cases. And the whole point of it is to ensure information sharing and collaboration between services. So this met that threshold. So at the time we held a meeting, both York and Peel came together to try and pool resources to try and solve this case and catch the individual responsible.
I'm thinking of the scenario in the tall grass. Does that scenario in the area make it the investigation of the surrounding immediate area very difficult?
It can, because the likelihood of someone interrupting it or seeing the victim there is slim. So I think the offender used that area much like he did in the Peel incident. He's using cover to try and prey on his victims and to bring them into areas that are isolated where he has less chance of detection.
Staff Sergeant, was DNA used much at this time as evidence and for solving cases?
So DNA was always been in use. So we use our partner agencies with the Center of Forensic Sciences. So they have qualified biologists who do all the analytical work, and they do other stuff other than DNA. They do handwriting analysis, tear analysis, and all different stuff with certain things. For this case, we use DNA. So that's what we had in our crime scene. And it was used back then. And however, fast forwarding to today, of course, technology, there's advancements with everything, right? So at that time, we sent our information to the Center of Forensic Sciences, who basically told us the offender is a male. And that was it. So that's all we had the information. We didn't have a name, date of birth, address, or anything like that, like how your driver's license would have.
Right. Yeah. So that's not a lot to go on. What is
no?
Yeah.
And there are certain things that we do as the police, sort of just to try to identify. So like canvassing. So there was a lot of extensive canvassing. So where the offense took place, there was businesses, residents. There's also street cameras, if you want to say. But back then 4K didn't exist like today.
Right.
So some of the video footages and stuff that we had wasn't as clear. It was a little bit grainy, and also the time of night. It was dark. Our offense, when it happened, the weather was, I'm going to say, in the teens. I'm going to say anywhere between 13 to 17 degrees. However, it was rainy and wet. Because I remember distinctly when we interviewed the victim in the incident that she was saying that she had a lot of mud and leaves because it was right around close, just fall was just coming where leaves were starting to fall and stuff like that. And that's when York had they had a forensic link. So then basically it was to tell us, okay, we don't know who the person is, but it's the same person that you guys are looking for.
Right. And did you then link up together after the multi-jurisdictional task force was made, Project Blue Light, and you guys basically became partners from two
We did. I
different
remember the phone call, actually.
Oh, really? What did that? What was that like? If you could take us back to it.
Yeah, no, it was just when we knew we had a linked case. I remember phoning Mustafa and we discussed how we were going to try and solve it and the resources that we would need. And then we put that into action. So ultimately, a combination of Peel Regional Police officers and York Regional Police officers met. We got together and we formed a task force. It was called the Blue Light Task Force at the time, just because transit buses in the GTA have blue lights on at night.
Okay.
And there was a link to transit clearly in both cases. So that was the meaning of the name. But
okay, I was going to ask you that. So thank you for getting that answer already.
Everyone's always curious about
Great investigation work there.
That was kind of what that was about. But we ultimately worked in an offsite location from our usual offices and worked together. And one of the things that I think came out of that was helpful was the brainstorming sessions on how we were going to try to further the investigation. In the end, we took that to both of our commands. Our commands met, and the Blue Light Task Force was formed. It was a task force that was made up of a combination of Peel Regional Police officers and York Regional Police officers from various units within our services. We worked at an offsite location from where we normally work. And we kind of combined all of our resources, our equipment, things like that, the sharing of vehicles and computers and things like that to try and maximize our ability to solve this case. And I think the thing with, that I really take when I look back at that was the brainstorming and the collaboration that we did, I think is what helped further the investigation. There were certain things that we did that we hadn't done in the past, and it gave us one of the big things was ancestry DNA testing. So that was the first time that I had ever done that. It was the first time we did that in York, actually, and I believe Peel as well. Correct?
Yeah.
And at the time, that's more common now, but at the time it wasn't, and it provided some focus on the investigation, because although we knew we had the same male offender, that's all we knew. We didn't know his ethnicity, his age, where he lived. All we know is that it's the same male who's committed these offenses. So you have to look for some kind of focus. And how do you do that? It's difficult if there's no witnesses, if canvassing and if video surveillance hasn't panned out. How do you identify who this was? So we ended up sending our DNA down to a lab in the US that the FBI had told us about. And they were able to extract the ethnicity of the offender. And that ethnicity came back as East Asian. So that's a large area of Asia, but it's still better than nothing.
Okay, so it's 2013. We got the DNA results. It said Asian descent. What happened? Where do we go from there?
So we tried to leverage that and focus our investigation on East Asian offenders and links to our victims, the potential links to the victims, the area. You're really chasing a ghost in these types of investigations, which I think that's part of the reason I think we both kind of enjoyed that work, because it is interesting. You're trying to find someone who's out there and you have to figure out who it is.
Yeah, the main thing that we looked at, because the York incident was the more fresh incident that happened compared to the Peel incident, which happened in 2013. And then the York incident happened in November 2014. So we looked at some similarities and like businesses. So if there's any similar type of businesses with the physical description that we got of the offender, because there was a description given that he was a muscular build, right? So we're looking, okay, is there any gyms or any workout places, right? And then a residential like stuff where we looked at people that recently moved from Mississauga to Richmond Hill. And if there was any people that came up in our investigation that were similar to that came up again in the York investigation. But there was
used a lot of provincial services, I'd say too, like ViClass, which is
what's that? Yeah.
It's the violent crime linkage analysis system, the sex offender registry, because they had crime analysts who were working the cases as well. So they were providing us with persons of interest as well to look at.
Well, I think that's what's really interesting about this is not only the techniques you're using, but we're getting really an insight into the emotional roller coaster and just the amount of work that police have to do. Like, you have a suspect who's Asian, go. Like, that is remarkable. And to go through that is just fascinating. So let's bring it to, I believe it was 2018, was it, when we got a genealogical investigation?
Yes.
Can you tell us what that's about?
Yeah. So as we were speaking earlier, forensics do advance like incredibly rapidly. And one of the more recent advancements in forensic science that police are using, especially in the US, is genealogy to help solve cold cases. So because in 2018, years had passed, the case was going cold, although we continued to work on it on a regular basis. We were trying to still look for new ways to help further the investigation. The FBI has formed a genealogical unit in the US. We reached out to them for assistance and wanted to retest our DNA to see if we could get anything further in relation to that. So we've sent off the DNA through them down to the US. It was sent to private labs. They take the DNA and they turn it into what's called a SNP file. And that DNA is then loaded onto ancestry databanks, things like 23andMe. Now, not that specific website, but
right. Just an example of what the services are. Yeah,
and you have to have consent to do that from the people who have given their DNA. So that's part of it. They're not taking this randomly. That the people have given consent all over the world on those sites. They have to check a box and say they consent to having this analyzed. But what that does is it looks at the offender's relatives. It looks at their DNA and looks at potential relatives. And it's been extremely successful in the US. The Golden State Killer in California is probably the most high profile one. It's been used in some more recent cases as well, but it's solving a lot of homicides and sexual assaults. So we sent our DNA down there and tried to get further information. And it worked to a point. The DNA suggested that our offender was most likely a Korean male. So that's a lot more focused than what we had before. However, when we started looking at relatives, it was too vast of an area for us to really go down. But that was our our attempt. We were going to try and see if we could find out potentially who relatives are, and then you work your way back. But it increased our investigation and furthered it somewhat. And then again, we focused on Korean males who potentially could have committed the offense, but ultimately it still went cold up until 2021.
Mm-hmm. Okay, take us to 2021 then.
So 2021, we got information from the Center for Forensic Sciences that there was another incident in Toronto where our offender's DNA was located at another crime scene.
So this is the third of the same offender.
So it was unrelated. So it wasn't part of that crime. There was another crime committed, but his left forensic evidence there from another incident, if you want to say. So from there, we received that information, and again, basically the process started all over again, where more meetings. So this time we had a third agency involved, part of the meetings, and through those meetings, it was determined that the two cases between Peel Regional Police and York Regional Police were directly linked as being a similar. The Toronto investigation was completely unrelated to our investigations. However, we got some of that information that we needed to help further our investigation, and as a result, it helped us further the investigation. So it was a little bit of a learning curve for both Simon and I to just understand and kind of comprehend the information that we're getting. But we were able to push through it, and we were able to identify two basically persons of interest from the witnesses, and move forward with that part of the investigation in the new one.
You guys are a great example of interdepartmental teamwork and the positives it creates, like this friendship that's come. This is wonderful. So what are some more positives that you see? And I'm coming to you after, Mustafa, from this interdepartmental teamwork.
Well, I just think it's important. I mean, it all started in Ontario with Bernardo because police agencies weren't really sharing information. Right. It's nice to kind of see it work the way it's supposed to work. And when you work together, I mean, you get that experience from different agencies, how they work. You know, there's things I've taken from Peel. There's things you've taken from York, I'm sure. You just get this vast array of different officers with different backgrounds, different experience, different ways that they operate. And we kind of combine all of that into one big unit. And you work so closely with each other for such a long period of time. You form strong bonds with those people. You kind of get to know how they work, their strong suits, their weak parts. You really, when you work as a cohesive unit, it just furthers and improves the investigation, and it pushes you to kind of keep going and going and going. I mean, I think that was one of the biggest takeaways from this is how well both York and Peel Regional Police kind of gelled, how well we shared everything, and how we never gave up. Like it went on for 10 years of collaboration. I mean, I don't think there's been a month that's gone by, over time where there hasn't been some kind of communication between the two services in relation to these events. So I think it's very important, and it's impactful on the investigation as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Mustafa?
No, I agree. Initially when we start off policing, our training's embedded to us. It's become sort of muscle memory. And so being in these investigative units, we're trained in major case management, all the protocols and guidelines that we have to follow. And with this case and with this kind of friendship with Simon, we got to apply that knowledge, right? So all the resource sharing, all the ongoing meetings, the communication, the commitment, right? So, and sometimes when you bring two organizations together, there's competing interests, right? So, but at the end of the day, both Simon and I had the same goal: is apprehending and identifying who was responsible for these two crimes.
All right, this was a great conversation. Thanks so much, guys. I'd like to thank Staff Sergeant Mustafa Durgan from Peel Police and Inspector Simon James from York. For Dispatches, I'm Eric Chapman.